Hello, so hi, I'm Hal and welcome back to my channel. This is going to be kind of wrapping up all the books that I read in February. I ended up reading 9 books in February, technically 10, but I read one and didn't track it at all. So I'm just going to kind of go through everything that I read. One thing that I'm going to say is that I have had a bit of a think about how I am rating books, and because I am in general a little bit of a harsh rater, I think. Like, 5 stars are only for things that I really love, and then a lot of things do get rated kind of 4 and 3 stars. I realised when I was looking back through everything that I read last year that there were things in my 3-star rating that like weren't actually at the same level as a lot of the other books that I'd rated 3 stars, so I've decided that if I'm reading a book and it's just okay, it's getting a 2-star, like, no matter what. So, like, am I being a bit of a hater? Yes, but I think that makes more sense than trying to, like, be kind, because I already, like, I feel like 3 is a good rate. Like, if I give something a 3, it means that I liked it, and I feel good about it, and I would recommend it to people. So there's no point in me giving that rating to things that I was just like, it's just okay, and that actually needs to go into a lower rating category for me. And that's how I've just decided to do it. Don't ask me questions. The first book that I read this month was the Haunting Season, by kind of various authors. This is another collection of short stories, kind of in the same vein, in the same way as The Winter Spirits, and this cover actually looks very similar to The Winter Spirits, I do think, where it's a collection of short stories, kind of short ghost stories set around the kind of winter time, and part of the reason that I know about it is because Natasha Pulley is one of the writers in this. In the Haunting Season, we do have slightly less stories. There are only 8 of them, but it's kind of that same kind of similar idea. I did find it really fun that the Natasha Pulley story in this is kind of had the characters from The Watchmaker of Filigree Street kind of going on a little Christmas trip together, which was very cute for me. And yeah, I felt like kind of similar to The Winter Spirits. All the stories work really well for kind of what they're trying to do, which is to be kind of spooky ghost horror stories set kind of around that winter period. Maybe because there were only 8 stories rather than the 12 in The Winter Spirits. In general, I just felt like these didn't hit me as well as the ones in the Winter Spirits collection did. So I did end up giving this kind of 3 stars compared to the 4 stars that I gave the Winter Spirits. But overall, it was a fun read. It was a good time. I would recommend it if, again, you're looking for kind of short ghost horror stories set in the winter time, which is what these are. The next book that I read was Silver in the Woods by Emily Tesh. This is a kind of a short kind of fantasy novella following our main character Tobias, who lives in the woods of Greenhallow and kind of looks after the land. He's kind of one of those, like, a green man type figure. And he looks after the woods and the kind of magical inhabitants there. And after many years, there is now a new lord for the Greenhallow kind of hall, called Henry Silver, who is very interested in the woods and what's going on kind of there and who Tobias is and stuff like that, and kind of wants to find out what's happened to the woods, and kind of things get complicated from there. I really like this. I like kind of things that are set in the woods and about kind of fae, and you know, it was such a cool atmosphere and it played with folklore in a really interesting way. I was reading this and it really reminded me of how, like, temperate rainforests are described in The Lost Rainforests of Britain, which is a really cool non-fiction book that I read last year. And it's just that vibe of these, like, old forests that kind of existed in the UK and still do in some places. But there's also, like, really funny bits and, like, really cute bits. Like, I was still sitting there, like, kicking my feet. Like, I really enjoyed this. Like, I like really want to read the little sequel novella. I'm considering getting a physical copy of this, even though, like, you know, I rated this 4 stars, and that's basically on the merit of it being a short story and it not kind of being any longer than it is. I think it works really well as a short story. It's, you know, it's got everything that you need to, but I just feel like, you know, it's not didn't have that like 5 stars for me, but absolutely great. Would recommend. It was a great time. The next book that I read, which is another kind of little short novella, was Yellow Jessamine by Starling. I found out about this author because I'm interested in one of her kind of upcoming books and found this available via my library. It's a short kind of horror novella following our main character, Evelyn Perdanu, who's kind of like a shipping magnate in this like town that's kind of slowly dying and at risk of being invaded. But when her like latest ship comes into port, a kind of a weird disease starts to kind of follow it, making the patient kind of obsessed with her. And then as things get kind of more complicated, she becomes a lot more like paranoid. She's retreating back into her house and kind of with the things that kind of she does. And you learn a lot more about like her past and her secrets and how she got to this place and things like that. This was okay. I think it's got bits that are kind of interesting. I think it does some things well, but there's nothing that I don't really have strong feelings about this book, both in a positive or in a negative manner. It was just kind of, things just kind of happened. Like, there's one bit that I was just like, oh, okay, we're going here. Okay, I guess. But yeah, it was just okay. It gets 2 stars. You know, do with it what you will. The next couple of books that I want to talk about are all the books in the Temeraire that I managed to read this month. So the first one that I managed to finish was Victory of Eagles by Noami Novik. This is the 5th book in the Temeraire series, which is an adult fantasy series, alternate history where there are dragons, and we start off with our main character, Captain William Lawrence, accidentally becoming, well, not accidentally, he fights a ship and gets control of it, coming into possession of a dragon egg that was meant to go to Napoleon. The dragon then hatches and he gets kind of roped into becoming the captain of this dragon and involved with the aerial corps in Britain. Obviously the dragon is the titular character, kind of is Temeraire. That's why the series is called this. And what the fight against Napoleon kind of looks like from this dragon-back perspective and kind of thing. We start this book kind of very much following on the events of the last book, where Lawrence and Temeraire have been charged with treason because they found out about the British Navy's plan to send over, which has happened, they sent over a sick dragon following the epidemic in the previous book to purposely get sick all the dragons in France so that they have a superiority there, but obviously this will then spread throughout Europe and kind of, you know, into the rest of the continent, into Asia as well. And, you know, Temeraire is Chinese, he's not gonna let that happen kind of thing, so they take over a cure, but obviously that's seen as a treasonous action. So at the beginning of this book, Temeraire is stuck in the breeding grounds because they want to use him for his kind of lineage as the kind of type of dragon that he is, whereas Lawrence is being kept as kind of in prison but like on a ship kind of thing. And things get a bit more complicated when Napoleon ends up invading Britain, and so Lawrence gets called back up to help with the resistance efforts, and Temeraire also, you know, starts some shit as well. This was really good. I felt like this had a lot of elements that were really fun. I think the main thing is that we do spend a lot of this book in the setting of like doing kind of guerrilla warfare on, you know, small numbers of French kind of combatants within the UK kind of thing. And that's quite a heavy topic when you're doing that type of warfare from Dragonback on kind of non-Dragonback civilians. They're not civilians, like non-Dragonback, like infantrymen. So Lawrence is understandably in a bad place for the majority of this book, and I think it's like it's dealt with kind of really interestingly and well and stuff like that, but it's a bit of a downer. So I did end up giving kind of this book 3 stars, mainly for that reason, but I do think it's really good, and it's an interesting look into kind of military history and things like that. The next book in that series that I also read is Tongues of Serpents, which is the sixth book in the series, and in this one is kind of the end point of the whole treason plot, and Lawrence and Tamara get sent to Australia, you know, partially as punishment and partially as kind of to set up a new aviation kind of core base there, as the British Empire are setting up their colony in Australia. And then kind of things get a bit more complicated. There's been an uprising against the governor who was installed in kind of New South Wales. We are there with a couple of dragon eggs, and kind of things get more complicated when one of those dragon eggs gets stolen, and we're on this kind of across Australian kind of interior, like, Dragon Black, like, investigation kind of thing. Tamara, being the absolute king he is and brooding over these eggs, is really cute as well. This was really fun in terms of kind of like actually having a lot more upbeat sections compared to the previous book. It is a really interesting look at kind of the colonization of like Australia, and looking at different kind of, you know, there was a lot of terra nullius like rhetoric in this book, like done by the British, which I knew about, but like it's always interesting to read about in a book that's set in that time and is doing a really good job at like presenting that history. But you're just there like, I know that there are native people living here. You need to stop saying that no one lives here. Please. You're going to meet some people later on this book, I swear to God. But yeah, I this was really fun. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. And then I also just finished Crucible of Gold, which is the 7th book in the series. And in this book, there's I guess like 2 main things going on, where, you know, we start off in Australia and Tamara and Lawrence get the option to leave and kind of work in some diplomatic missions. One of them is to the Incan Empire, which I guess is like modern day Peru or kind of Central America. There's a lot of discussion about the Andes, who the British are trying to get as kind of a ally in the fight against Napoleon. And the other part is also going to Brazil in Rio, because following the events of previous books, I can't remember the name, but the one where they're in Africa, basically one of the African tribes, the Setswana, have made kind of this really shaky alliance with Napoleon, where them and their dragons are able to be transported over to Brazil because they're trying to get the members of their tribe that were enslaved kind of back. And so they're also being sent kind of to them as kind of a diplomatic mission as well, trying to, well, the ambassadors are trying to like back up the Portuguese, and Tamara is there, and whereas Tamara and Lawrence are there like, you should give them their people back. Because one of the main central tenets of this book is that Lawrence himself is an abolitionist, his father is an abolitionist and worked with like, his father worked with like William Wilberforce and stuff, so like that is something that's going on in this book. This was fun. I do feel like it fell into one of those traps where I kept on zoning out in parts whilst I was listening to this audiobook, because I would just be thinking about other stuff instead of like actually following what was being said. So I have, partially because I didn't feel like the library was going to give me the next audiobook in time, partially because I just think it's time. I'm taking a little bit of a break, and then I'll come back and I'll feel a bit more reinvigorated in this story, which definitely happened when I was able to listen to kind of these 3 audiobooks back to back. Because yeah, in general I do really like this story, but I think that reading all of them back to back to back sometimes just makes me a little bit bored in what's going on. But I end up giving Crucible of Gold 3 stars as well, mainly for that, losing a bit of interest kind of as I was listening to this story. The next book that I read was Infinity Alchemist by Kacen, Callender, I assume is how you say his name. This is a copy from the library, but for some reason has like sprayed edges, which is wild. I have another different book from the library, which is again an insane edition that they've just let me have. This is a young adult fantasy novel, kind of set in like kind of a different world, but it's very much just like the northern, like northeast United States. Like there's a map in this. Like that's what like the northeast United States and Canada look like. I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on that, I don't live there. But yeah, basically we have this main kind of force of magic in this world, which is alchemy, and we follow our main character, kind of Ash Woods, who has always wanted to study alchemy, but because he doesn't have the because of like financial and class limitations, was never able to pass the kind of test to kind of get into one of these schools where they teach you how to do alchemy, even though he has like a natural talent for it. Through a series of events, he's working kind of as a gardener in one of these schools. He encounters and his talent gets discovered by Ramsay Thorne, who is like a child prodigy of like disgraced alchemist parents, and is kind of like the youngest, like she's not actually a professor, but like has a teaching role kind of thing. And they start to work together to find out more about an incredibly powerful object called the Book of Source, which is kind of gives you access to kind of all of the magical power in the world kind of thing. And things get a lot more complicated and messy from there. It's a lot of Ash and Ramsay getting closer. It's a lot of kind of learning more about their backstories and kind of, a lot of things happen in this book. There's also another character who I've not mentioned at all, but that was kind of a surprise to me. So if you're gonna read this, I think that's a fun surprise to come in there. One of the main things that is going on in this book is that Ash is a trans man and that Ramsay is gender fluid and uses he and she pronouns kind of depending on what gender they are. I do believe like the author is trans, and I guess like broad strokes it's handled well kind of thing. I do think that especially with fantasy settings, there's often an urge to kind of explain about like being trans and making that overly complicated when it doesn't really need to be, and that's definitely like a personal flaw that I had with this book. But in this book, basically you're able to kind of project your energy, that kind of alchemy, and other people will kind of be able to sense what pronouns and kind of gender you are kind of thing. Pronouns you use, gender you are. Which is an easy get out of jail free card to explain why everyone always knows what pronouns Ramsay uses. And it just like, it's fine in this setting, but that's not how that works in the real world kind of thing, which is a little bit frustrating. And yeah, I have issues in general with a lot of like trans fiction, just because I feel like there's never a good middle ground between you can transition and basically look like a cis person and there's no transition options at all. And I'm like, we've been doing like surgeries and hormones since the 1930s for sure. Give me better options. But in terms of like the fantasy story and like the relationships and stuff like that, I feel like that was like pretty good and like interesting and stuff like that. I'm definitely interested in picking up the next book in this series. And overall I gave this 3 stars there. The next book that I read was the Ornithologist Field Guide to Love by India Holton. This is very kind of outside what I normally read, but I did want to read something that was just silly and fun, which is definitely this. It's like a historical kind of fantasy romance, but it's definitely more of a like rom-com than any of those other things. We are ostensibly set in kind of Victorian era. It's kind of a steampunk Victorian era without it actually being steampunk. And there's also like magical birds as well. That's the fantasy element mainly of this. And we follow Beth Pickering, who is like the youngest Cambridge professor for ornithology. she is about to capture one of these like rare birds along with like her mentor when it gets stolen by, you know, a different team made up of Devon Lockley and his mentor. Devon Lockley is also a very young kind of Oxford professor, but, you know, he got his degree from America, like shock, horror. And then kind of pretty soon after that, they kind of, you know, she's like, I'm gonna hate him for the rest of her life. And then very soon after that, a competition is announced to win if they catch this incredibly rare bird that's, you know, never been sighted in the UK before. They will win Birder of the Year and also get tenure at their university. And through a complicated series of events, they end up kind of working together and finding out that there's more going on to this competition than first seems, and also fall in love. You know, that kind of thing. So the thing is, I do feel like this book is well written. It's written with like a very modern kind of tone. But it is on purpose. It doesn't feel like the author just can't write Victorian England. And she does some interesting things with that, and she does some interesting things with tropes. So, like, there are sections in these books where it's third-person limited, but, like, there'll be things, like, crossed out to give you an idea of what these people's, like, thought processes are, and, like, even the things that, like, they're hiding from themselves kind of thing. And she, in terms of tropes, like, you know, they'll be going and having to stay in, like, inns and stuff, and it'll be like, and there was only ... and instead of it being like, there's only one bed, it'd be like, oh, they have to stay in a room, but there's too many beds, it's uncomfortable, they do not have places to sleep, or, you know, they finally do get into a room with one bed that they have to share, but it is a child's bedroom kind of thing. And, like, each of these things, like, more of the humorous bits, I did feel like if this happens another time, it's gonna get old. And that was the point that it didn't happen again. But I was having that thought kind of thing. If you're fine with something being very silly and having some bits that are, you know, annoying, this is a fun book. If you can't deal with, like, silly, annoying, stray bullshit, it's not the book for you. I would say if I didn't have such a fun time reading this would be a 2-star book from me, but I did have a fun time. So I am giving it 3 stars, but it's incredibly with that caveat of this was a fully silly, goofy time and I had fun with it. I don't think it's going to be a silly, goofy time for everyone because there's definitely flaws in the tone that's approached to this story kind of thing. The last book that I read this month, so in February, was If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. This is one of those books that I'd always heard about, and I, like, in general, have a complicated relationship with, like, the dark academia genre. I went to university in Edinburgh, which is the place where all of the dark academia photos come from, which is wild because, you know, you walk past those streets all the time kind of thing. And, like, I get it. I love Gothic architecture. I think those, you know, Edinburgh is a gorgeous city kind of thing. I love the vibes. I personally had a study blog on Tumblr for a very long time, but my studying is not, or has never been, the aesthetic that did well in those regards. But, like, I feel like often the, like, dark academic aesthetic gets used in books and we don't actually talk about the issues that are present, especially in the UK, regarding academia and the kind of glamorization of these places like Cambridge and Oxford, and to an extent other kind of red brick universities like Edinburgh, you know, and stuff like that, which is the classism and elitism that is inherent in these systems, and the fact that a lot of these places are also built on a history and legacy of colonialism. I'm trepidatious every time a book is like, it's dark academia. And there's been ones that I've adored. I really like Babel by R.F. Kuang, and there's been ones that I've absolutely hated. Don't get me started on the Axis Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake. I want to kill her. But basically what happened is I read a sample of this. I realised that this is actually about obnoxious theatre kids. I went, oh, sign me right up. So we are following 7 final year students at Delaware College, which is like this small niche college, like liberal artsy college in the US, where they are, you know, in the theatre class for this. And by theatre class, I do explicitly mean that they're just doing Shakespeare. And we follow kind of this class in their final year, you know, as things get more complicated, as their very kind of complex and tangled and kind of toxic relationships gets even more complex and tangled, as they, you know, some of them break out of some of the roles that they've always been cast in, and as things get a lot more serious when one of them turns up dead. This was great. I really loved this. One of the most like iconic parts of this is that they are obnoxious Shakespeare students, and they will use Shakespeare quotes like in their daily speech kind of thing. They have this like Shakespeare pigeon kind of going on. Incredible. As soon as I realized that they were pretentious, obnoxious theatre students, I was like, this makes so much sense. They can do whatever they want. I will totally understand anything that happens in this book based on that. And I think the story unfolded like really well. We get a good balance of like things being revealed to us, like good plotting, foreshadowing. A lot of the time I was like, I think either this or this is going to happen, you know. And I felt for these characters. I wanted, you know, things to work out for them, and, you know, and when sometimes it did, and things got worse because of it, kind of thing. Our main character is kind of Oliver, and he has, you know, various relationships with various other casts. His relationship with James, at a very certain point, did make me go, I don't think them having gay sex would fix whatever's going on here, but it would be fun for me. And I was so correct throughout the rest of the book. I was like, okay, they didn't need gay sex to make this more complicated than it already is. But for me, but yeah, like, the ending of this, I'm still thinking about that. The way that all made it kind of click for me, I was like, this is great. Like, you know, in kind of a bold move after I've just talked about this, I did only end up giving this 4 stars. And I think those are mainly me issues rather than issues with the book. I was reading this, you know, as I mentioned, I first read a sample of it, and when I read that sample, I was absolutely obsessed with the writing style. I felt like it worked really well, which is still something that's true when I read it, the full book, but I wasn't as engrossed in it as I was that first time, which I know is a me problem, but like, it meant that it was a little bit more difficult to kind of get into. And also, the technical 10th book that I also read this month, I was reading this at the same time I was rereading The Sunshine Court by Nora Sakavic in preparation for reading The Golden Raven, which came out on the 22nd. And I could tell that, like, the Sunshine Court, obsessed with it. My favourite book of, like, one of my favourite books of last year. If We Were Villains was not, like, it was kind of an unfair comparison to put, like, this new book that I read up against a continuation of a series that I've loved since 2016, but it did happen. And so I might reflect on this rating, and it might change, especially if I, you know, do a reread or something like that. But how I felt about it is very similar to how I felt about, like, Silver in the Woods, compared to, you know, how I felt about The Sunshine Court, which is a 5 stars for me. In that regard, I haven't really tracked this anywhere because it was just a fun reread for me, and I'm like ahead of where my Goodreads reading goal is anyway, so I don't really care. And it was causing me stress if I had to track it. I'm going to be so honest. Insane thing to say, to be fair. I'm having stress because I'm too far ahead of where I should be reading-wise. But, like, I didn't really track it because I didn't think I was going to have anything to say about it, because I was just getting into the right mindset and remembering everything that happened in this book, so I was fully prepared going into The Golden Raven. But I do feel like taking that time to reread it made that I actually appreciated a lot of the writing more than I did the first time, because I wasn't devouring the next part of this story. I was going like, wow, I really like Nora Sakavic's writing style. This really works for me. But yeah, that is everything that I read in February. I'm doing great. In terms of obviously what I'm reading at the moment, I'm reading The Golden Raven. No one is surprised. I'm having a great time with it. Don't worry about it. And I'm also reading Foreign Bodies by Simon Schwabmer, which is about, like, is a non-fiction about disease and vaccination and global health and stuff like that. Sometimes you just gotta read a book about public health. You know, it's one of those things. So I think that's everything that I wanted to kind of talk about today. I feel like I've not talked about these books as much as I did last time, but sometimes that's just how it is. I hope that you're reading some interesting books and that you're having a nice day. Bye!